The first thing I heard was the silence. Not the good kind of silence, not the kind you get on a Sunday morning when the world is still asleep and the coffee is hot and nothing has gone wrong yet. This was the silence that comes after something loud has stopped, the kind that sits in your chest like a stone and makes you check your exits without knowing why. I was crouched behind a toppled concrete barrier on Route 9, the old highway that used to carry commuter traffic between Harlow and the city. Nothing moved on that road now. The street lights were out, the signal towers were down, the only light came from the fires burning somewhere behind the tree line to the east, and they painted everything in a low orange glow that made ordinary things look wrong. My name is Marcus Webb, Sergeant formerly of the 3rd Infantry, 22 years of service. I had done 2 deployments in places most maps do not bother naming anymore, and I had come home both times on my own 2 feet. I was the kind of man who did not panic. My old commanding officer used to say I was the sort of person who, in the middle of a house fire, would stop to check whether he had left the stove on. He meant it as a compliment. Tonight, though, even I was running the numbers and not liking the answers I was getting. The evacuation order had gone out 48 hours ago. Harlow was supposed to be empty by now. I had stayed behind on assignment. Someone had to manage the last checkpoint and make sure the stragglers got through. My unit had moved north with the main column at dawn. The plan was simple. I would hold the checkpoint until midnight, confirm the road was clear, and then follow in the support vehicle we had left for me. The support vehicle was currently a pile of warped metal about 200 m south of where I was kneeling. Something had landed on it. I did not see what. I heard the impact, a sound like a wrecking ball dropped from a great height, and by the time I turned around, the vehicle was already flat, not crushed, flat, as though whatever hit it simply did not consider the metal worth stepping around. That had been 11 minutes ago. Since then, nothing. I held my rifle and I listened. The thing about spending your adult life in places where being careless gets people around you hurt is that you develop certain habits. You learn to read quiet the way other people read newspapers. You learn that the absence of birds means something, that a dog that stops barking is more alarming than one that starts, that the particular quality of still air before something moves through it has a texture you can feel on the back of your neck. Every single one of those instincts was screaming at me right now. I had read the briefings everyone had 6 weeks ago. 3 objects entered the atmosphere, a pattern that no meteor shower could explain. They did not crash. They descended slowly, deliberately, like something that had done this many times before and saw no reason to rush. Governments released statements. Scientists gave interviews. People argued on the internet about what it meant. For about 72 hours, the entire planet held its breath in collective amazement. Then the reports started coming from the eastern cities. The alien briefing files described the scouting unit by its catalog designation first and its common name second. The common name translated from the first alien transmission that humanity managed to decode was the Vorai. The translation was approximate. The original word, according to the linguists, was closer to something like the thing that everything else avoids. The briefings went into biological detail that I had read 3 times and still had trouble believing. 9 ft tall bipedal but capable of moving on all limbs at speed. Armored with a natural dermal layer, denser than military-grade composite, with sensory organs that detected heat, motion, and bioelectric signatures. Simultaneously, the briefing said the Vorkai had been encountered by 4 other known species before humanity. The briefings also noted in very careful and very neutral language that those 4 species no longer had a presence in the sectors where the Vorkai operated. I had underlined that part, then I had read it again, then I had put the briefing down and gone to get more coffee because some information needs a moment to settle. Before you can look at it straight, I shifted my position slowly, keeping low, moving along the concrete barrier toward the collapsed overpass ahead. The fires to the east were getting brighter. That was not good. Fires spreading meant no one was putting them out, which meant what I already suspected: I was the only living person for several kilometers in any direction, which meant whatever had flattened my vehicle was not looking for anyone else. I heard it before I saw it. The sound was not loud, and that was the most frightening part. Something that size should have made noise, a footstep that heavy should have cracked the asphalt, should have echoed off the concrete pylons, should have announced itself the way a large thing does when it moves through a world built for smaller creatures. Instead, I heard almost nothing, just the faintest displacement of air, a low rhythmic sound almost like breathing but slower than any animal I had ever stood near. And then a shadow moved across the overpass above me. I did not look up. Not directly. I used the reflection in a shattered car window 10 ft to my left. And what I saw made every training instinct I had kick in simultaneously. It was exactly as large as the briefings had said. It crouched on the edge of the overpass with an ease that suggested the height meant nothing to it. One limb braced against a broken girder, its head elongated, rigged, with no visible eyes. In any arrangement a human face would suggest, tilted slightly to one side. Its skin, if you could call it that, moved, not the way muscles move under skin, but the way the surface itself was, shifting patterns of bioluminescence running across it in slow diagnostic pulses of deep amber and pale blue, like it was thinking, like the thinking showed on the outside. I stayed perfectly still. Then I heard something else. It was small, and it came from directly behind me, from under the wreckage of an overturned delivery truck that had jackknifed across the 2 leftmost lanes sometime during the evacuation. A soft sound, a whimper, the specific heartbreaking sound of an animal that is trying very hard to be quiet and is not quite managing it. My eyes went to the truck without my permission. The creature on the overpass turned its head. I moved without thinking about it, not toward the exit, not toward cover. I moved toward the truck, toward that small frightened sound, and I dropped to one knee beside the gap between the undercarriage and the road to surface, and I looked in. Dog looked back at me, medium-sized, brown and white, one ear folded the wrong way, ribs visible beneath a coat that had not seen a good meal in several days. His eyes were enormous in the dark. He was shaking from the tip of his nose to the end of his tail, but he had not run because there was nowhere left to run to, and somehow that small fact hit me harder than anything else that had happened in the last 11 minutes. He had not been left behind on purpose. He had been lost in the chaos of evacuation. the way 100 other things get lost when an entire population moves at once. He was just a dog sitting in the dark under a broken truck in a city that no longer had anyone in it, trembling at a sound he could not identify and a danger he could not understand. I reached in slowly. He pressed his cold nose against my fingers. I looked up. The Vorkai had dropped from the overpass. It landed 30 ft from me without a sound, and it straightened to its full height, and the bioluminescent patterns on its body shifted, cooler now, a deep steady blue. And it looked at me, and it looked at the dog, and it took one slow, deliberate step forward. I stood up. I put myself between the dog and the creature, and I raised my rifle, and for the first time in 22 years of military service, I felt my hands start to shake. I looked at them. I told them to stop. They did. I exhaled slow and controlled, the way I had been trained to exhale. When the moment you have spent your whole career preparing for finally arrives and everything in the world gets very quiet and very clear, the Vorkai tilted its head again. It had never, I suspected, had anything step between it and what it was moving toward. I kept my eyes on it, and I said in a low and even voice, "Not this one." The dog pressed against the back of my leg and made that small sound again. The Vorkai stared at me with whatever it used to see, and neither of us moved. The Vorhi's bioluminescence shifted again. The blue deepened, and small threads of red began running through it like cracks in something that was about to break. I had no way to know what the colors meant. The briefings had mentioned the bioluminescence but offered no translation guide. I was working blind, which in my experience is the situation where you either go very quiet inside your own head or you go very loud. I have always been a quiet inside kind of person. The creature moved not toward me. Sideways, a slow lateral step that took it to my left, which forced me to turn. Which was, I realized the point. It was testing whether I would lose track of what was behind me when I moved to track it, whether the dog would be exposed in the second it took me to pivot. I did not pivot. I stepped left with it, keeping my body in the same position relative to the truck, keeping the gap, and the dog at my back. The Vorkai stopped. I had the distinct and deeply strange feeling that I had just passed some kind of test, and that the test had surprised it. Behind me, the dog made a small sound, not a whimper this time, but a short, low noise that was almost curious, as though he was trying to see between my legs and understand what was happening under different circumstances. I might have found that funny. I kept my eyes forward. I kept my breathing even. I thought about the briefings again, specifically the section on the Voorhees behavioral patterns as reconstructed from what little data the alien transmissions had contained. The analysts had been careful in their language, the way people are careful when the information they are presenting is so far outside normal parameters that ordinary language starts to feel inadequate. The Vorai did not negotiate. It did not delay. When it identified something as prey, it moved. And it moved with total commitment, and nothing in its recorded history had ever slowed that movement down once it had begun, except apparently me. I was not flattering myself. I knew the math. I was one soldier with one rifle, and the briefings had been very clear about the fact that standard military rounds had limited effect on Vorkai dermal armor. I had a sidearm and a combat knife and 2 grenades on my belt, and the kind of stubborn refusal to be moved that my mother had always called my worst quality. But it had stopped, and it was watching me, and the watching had a quality to it that I had not expected. From the briefings, it was not the watching of something deciding when to act, it was the watching of something that was genuinely uncertain, something that encountered a variable it did not have a category for. I decided to give it more variables. I know you can hear me, I said. I do not know if your translators are running. I do not know if you understand a word of what I am saying, but I am going to keep talking, because the one thing I am not going to do is be quiet right now. The Vorkai's head tilted to the other side. The red threads in its bioluminescence faded. What replaced them was something I had no name for. A complex interlocking pattern that moved too fast for me to track, rippling across its chest and shoulders like a question being asked in a language I could not read. His name is Biscuit, I said. At least that is what I am calling him. He does not have a collar. He does not have anyone left in this city, and I am not moving. The dog. Biscuit pressed harder against the back of my leg, as though he understood, or at least as though the sound of my voice in the dark was the only thing that felt like safety, and he was leaning into it with everything he had. The Vorai stared at me. I stared back. The orange glow from the eastern fires flickered across the road between us. Somewhere far away, something structural gave way, a sound like a long breath followed by silence. The creature took one more step forward, just one, and then it stopped again, and the bioluminescent pattern slowed, and for a long moment it was perfectly still, and I had the strangest feeling that we were both waiting to see which of us would change our mind first. I had made my decision back at the gap under the truck when a cold nose pressed against my fingers in the dark. I was not changing anything. My hands were completely steady now. The translator came online at some point during the second hour. I know it was the second hour because I had been counting, not seconds. That would have made me crazy. But the rough passages of time that you learn to track when you have spent enough nights in places where keeping track of time is the difference between making it to morning and not. Every 15 minutes or so, I did a quiet inventory. Rifle position, exits, the slow breathing of the dog against my leg, the behavior of the creature standing 30 ft in front of me in the middle of a dead road in a dead city. The Vorkai had not moved in a way I could call movement. It had shifted, small adjustments, weight transfers, the way a deeply patient thing settles into a position it is prepared to hold for a long time. Its bioluminescence had calmed down to a low, steady amber pulse that moved slowly across its torso, up its neck, and back down again, rhythmic and almost hypnotic. I had stopped trying to read meaning into the colors and started just watching the pattern as information, knowing it was there, noting when it changed, filing each change without trying to interpret it. My legs were starting to complain. I had been in a half crouch for too long. I adjusted my weight slowly, shifting one foot back, straightening my right knee an inch, making the adjustment so gradual that the total change in my silhouette was almost nothing. The Vorai tracked the movement with whatever served it as attention. It did not react. Beyond that, Biscuit had fallen asleep. I know that sounds impossible. A dog asleep in the middle of a standoff with an alien predator, but dogs have a relationship with sleep that humans have lost somewhere over the centuries. Biscuit was exhausted. He had been exhausted before I found him. Once the shaking stopped and he understood on whatever level a dog understands things, that I was between him and whatever was out there, and I was going to stay there. His body made its decision, independent of the crisis, and simply shut down. He was curled against the back of my left boot, and I could feel the slow rise and fall of his side against my ankle. I found that I was glad he was asleep, not because it made the situation less dangerous, it did not, but because it gave me something concrete to not disturb. A sleeping dog at my feet was a very specific kind of reason to stay absolutely still, and I have always done better with specific reasons. The translator warbled. It was not a sound was expecting, and I have to be honest, for 1/2 second I startled. Not visibly, nothing that would have shown up on a camera, but internally my entire system fired a brief alarm and then immediately canceled it. The sound came from the Vorkai, from somewhere on its body near the junction of its neck and what might have been a shoulder, a device I had not noticed before, activated with a low cycling tone that went through 3 frequencies and then settled. Then it spoke. The word that came out was in English. Technically, the pronunciation was wrong in every possible way. Too much resonance in some places, certain consonants converted into sounds that the human vocal range does not produce. The rhythm of it completely unlike anything spoken by a person, but it was English, and the word was explain. I looked at it for a moment. Explain what I said. There was a pause. The translator cycled again, lower this time than this. I understood. I thought what it was asking, not about me specifically, and not about the rifle. It was asking about the arrangement, the fact of me standing in a specific place, in a specific posture, for reasons it could not map onto anything in its experience. It had identified that there was a logic here, and it wanted access to that logic. That was the moment I understood something important about the Vorai that the briefings had not quite captured. They were intelligent, not just capable of strategy, not just biologically superior, but genuinely deeply intelligent in the way that means you want to understand things before you move past them. The 4 species it had encountered before humanity, the ones the briefings described in that careful, neutral language, perhaps they had not engaged with the Vorai intellectually. Perhaps they had simply responded with fear or aggression or submission. Perhaps none of them had been standing in the dark in a dead city, refusing to explain themselves. I said, I am protecting him. The translator processed for 3 seconds, then from anything that wants to harm him, I said, including you. Another long pause. Amber bioluminescence on its chest shifted, and a cool thread of something I could only describe as white silver moved through it briefly before fading. He is small, the translator produced. He is not armed. He does not fight. He is not your offspring. Explain the logic. There it was. The question underneath. The question, I thought about how to answer it, not because I did not know the answer, but because the answer was one of those things that is completely obvious when you are inside it, and almost impossible to explain to someone who has never felt it. It was like being asked to explain why music sounds different when you are happy versus when you are sad. The words exist technically, but they flatten the thing they are trying to describe. Logic is Not always the right word for it, I said. He cannot protect himself, that is exactly why I am here, the translator. Cycled, when it spoke again it produced something that was not quite a word. Sound that fell between two English words and seemed to be trying to choose between them. The two words it was choosing between were, as best I could hear them, inefficient and interesting. I decided to keep talking. My name is Marcus Webb, I said. I have been a soldier for 22 years. I have been situations where the correct tactical decision was to leave something behind. I know what that decision feels like. When you make it, I have made it before. In other places, and I carry every single one of those moments. That is what we do. We carry them. Tonight I decided I was done making that particular decision, so here I am, the vor I was, utterly still while the translator processed this. The amber light pulsed. Then it took a step, not back, forward. One step, slow and deliberate, closing the distance between us from 30 ft to 23. I did not move. I kept the rifle up. My eyes stayed on the center of its body mass, because that is where you look when you cannot afford to be faked out by a head movement or a limb shift, and because 22 years of training does not evaporate just because the thing you are pointing a rifle at is something that has never been pointed at before. I know. You could take me, I said. I have read about your kind. I know what the math says. I want you to know that I have read it, and I have done the numbers, and I am standing here anyway because the math is not the only thing in play right now. The creature stopped at 23 feet. The bioluminescence on its upper body flared briefly, the brightest I had seen it, a sudden bloom of deep blue that expanded and then contracted like a long, slow breath. It was performing a threat display. I had read about those too. A full Vori threat display had been described as sufficient to trigger a flight response in any mammal with functional threat detection instincts. The sound component, a low-frequency emission from structures in its chest, operated below the threshold of human hearing but registered in the body as a deep, nauseating wave of wrongness that every animal instinct in a human nervous system would interpret as run. I felt it. I want to be honest about that. I felt it roll through me from the soles of my feet to the top of my skull, and every single primitive part of my brain lit up red and screamed a word that was not a word but was very clearly a direction. Behind me, Biscuit woke up. He made a low sound, more like a question. I exhaled slowly. I hear you, I said to the creature. I understand what you are telling me, and I need you to understand something in return. That display works on everything that does not know it is coming. I knew it was coming. I have known everything about you that humanity has been able to learn in the last 6 weeks, and I came out here anyway. The bioluminescence dimmed. It was subtle, the kind of change you would miss if you were not watching closely, if you were not the sort of person who spent their career learning how to read the body language of things that were trying to hurt you. The display retracted. The deep blue cooled. What replaced it was something quieter and more complex. Why, the translator said, does knowing change the response? It was a genuine question. I could tell, because the pattern on its skin changed when it asked, the same way a person's face changes when they stop performing and start actually asking something in. It was genuinely curious about the answer, because knowing is what we do. I said we find out what is scary, and then We decide whether it is worth being scared of. Sometimes it is, sometimes it is not. Tonight I decided it is not worth being scared of you. In fact, the translator said, I am dangerous too. You, yes, I said, and I am still here. Those two things are both true at the same time. The Vorkai looked at me for a long time, then it looked past me at the gap under the truck where Biscuit was, now standing with his head between my knees, watching with enormous dark eyes. I watched the creature look at the dog. I watched it try to understand what it was seeing, the amber light on its body slowed to the pace of a heartbeat. I shifted my weight slightly, bringing my left foot forward a half-inch, which anyone watching would have recognized as someone settling in, someone who has decided they are going to be standing in this exact spot for as long as it takes. I am not moving, I said. The translator took a moment, then it said in its borrowed and broken English, you are certain? Yes, even knowing what I am. Especially knowing what you are. The creature made a sound that did not go through the translator. A low, resonant hum that I felt more than heard, that came from somewhere deep in its chest and went up through the road into my boots and my shins and into my own chest. And it was not a threat display, it was something else, something the translator apparently did not have an English equivalent for. Biscuit pressed his head against my knee. I put one hand on his ears without taking my eyes off the creature, and I felt him lean into it. And the Vorkai watched that small exchange with an attention so focused and so complete that I could feel it the way you feel sunlight on your face. It was trying to understand something that it did not have the right framework to understand, and it knew it. And that knowledge, that gap in its own comprehension, was the most interesting thing that had ever happened to it. I had read 4 species worth of data. The briefings I had read about their encounters with the Vorkai. I had read about the end of those encounters. None of those species I suspected had ever made a Vorai curious. Tell me your name, I said. The translator processed for a long time, then it produced a sound that was not English and was not a name in any human sense, a layered, complex vocalization that seemed to contain its own echo, as though the creature's identity was something that required more than one frequency to express. I cannot make that sound, I said. Can I call you something else? The pattern on its body shifted. The translator said, you may attempt. Voss, I said. Is that acceptable? A pause, then. It is a reduction. Most things are when you translate them, I said. Something in the bioluminescence shifted, and I could not be sure, but it looked very briefly like the pattern was doing something that I had no other word for than amused. I kept my rifle up. I kept my hand on Biscuit's head. I kept my eyes on Voss. And slowly, in the fire-lit dark of a city that had emptied of everything except the 2 most dangerous things currently standing on this road, the night moved toward whatever came next. You have not fired your weapon, the translator said. The statement came without context, without preamble, as though it were the next sentence in a conversation that had been going on for much longer than the one we were having. No, I said. You raised it. Yes, you have not lowered it. No, the Vorkai Voss seemed to consider this. The amber pattern pulsed twice in quick succession, and then steadied. In the encounters we have recorded, it said through the badly shaped English of the translator, when the lower species raise a weapon and do not fire, it is because they have concluded that firing would be useless. They lower the weapon because they are. Accepting the outcome, I raised it, I said, because I intend to fire it if you move past me. You know the rounds will have limited effect. Limited, I said, is not the same as none. It tilted its head. You are calculating on the small margin. I am calculating on the only margin available to me. I said that is what you do when the situation is what it is. You work with what you have and you do not waste energy wishing for better tools. The translator took a moment with that. Then your species is very small. Yes, your planet is not heavily contested. There are richer targets. There is no clear reason why a scout unit would prioritize this region. I had been wondering when it would get to this part. The briefings had mentioned that the Vorkai functioned as advanced scouts for a larger collective, beings that did not travel to conquer so much as they traveled to assess and classify, which meant Voss was here to determine whether this planet and this species required a particular kind of attention. Whatever report it sent back would shape what came next for every living person who had evacuated from Harlow and from 1,000 cities like it across the planet. Is that what you are doing? I asked, deciding. Observing the translator said, the two are not always separate. I nodded slowly. I had already understood that on some level, that this was not just a physical standoff but an informational one. Everything Voss was learning from this encounter would go somewhere, would be weighed against everything it had observed about humanity in the 6 weeks since arrival. I was in this moment, without having chosen to be a data point, possibly the most important data point a member of my species had ever been. The thought should have made me more careful about what I said. Instead, it made me decide to be more honest. Then observe this, I said. My vehicle is destroyed. My unit is gone. My radio has no signal. I am alone in a city that has been evacuated with a rifle and a dog and no exit, and I am standing here anyway, not because I have calculated a path to survival, because there is something behind me that needs someone in front of it, and I am the only person available. Silence long enough that I started to wonder if the translator had failed. Then the attachment Voss said to the animal, yes, it is not rational. Lot of the best things are not, I said. The bioluminescence ran a pattern I had not seen before, starting at its feet and moving up its body in a slow wave, changing color as it rose, amber at the base, cooling to green, then to pale blue at its shoulders before fading at the ridges of its head. I watched it happen, and I thought it was the most extraordinary thing I had ever seen, and I kept my rifle up anyway. The animal, Voss said, it trusts you. He does. I said, why? I thought about this for a moment. Then I said, because I showed up, because I stayed, because when he was frightened and alone in the dark, I put my hand out and I did not pull it back. That is more or less the whole of it. The translator cycled when it spoke. Again, the word it produced was one I had not expected. Permanent. What the trust? Voss said, it is a permanent arrangement, not conditional on outcome. I looked down at Biscuit. He was sitting now, his front feet neat together, his ears slightly raised, his eyes moving between me and the massive shape in the darkness ahead of us with an expression of total uncomplicated reliance on my judgment. Yes, I said, permanent. Voss was quiet for a long time. Then it took a step back, just one step, slow and deliberate, and I did not relax, not even a fraction, because I had been in enough situations to know that a step back is not always retreat. Sometimes it is just a different angle, but it watched me carefully as it did it. Watched my face, watched my hands on the rifle, watched for any change in my posture that would tell it something about how I read the movement. I gave it nothing. I stayed exactly where I was. You have been standing in that position for 2 hours and 7 minutes. Translator said, I know. I said, your body is experiencing physical strain. Also correct, you will not sit down. No. The bioluminescence did the thing that I had begun to think might be amusement. Again, that brief quicksilver shift in the pattern that did not match any of the other states I had catalogued. Then Voss said something that the translator had difficulty with. It tried twice, cycling through the frequencies before it produced a version that was close enough to English to parse. You are the strangest thing I have observed. In a good way or a bad way? I asked. Another long pause. Then neither category fits. I let out a slow breath. That is probably the most honest answer anyone has given me in 22 years. Biscuit at that precise moment sneezed. It was a small sound in all that vast fire orange darkness, and it surprised him. He startled at his own sneeze, his ears going flat, his eyes going wide for half a second before he recovered his composure, stood up, shook himself, and looked around as though making sure no one had noticed. I did not laugh. I wanted to, but I held it together because I was holding a rifle on an alien apex predator, and this was not technically the moment for laughter. Voss went completely still. It stared at Biscuit. Biscuit looked back at it. Then Biscuit sat down again, scratched his left ear with his back foot, and rested his chin on my boot. The silence that followed had a completely different quality from every silence that had come before it. It was not the silence of threat assessment or strategic patience or careful observation. It was the silence of something encountering an input that none of its analytical frameworks had been built to handle, and trying to figure out which framework to build from scratch. He is not afraid of me now, Voss said. No, I said, not right now. He trusts me, and I am not afraid of you, so he has decided not to be afraid of you either. He is taking my word for it. The translator produced the word my behavior. I clarified, he is reading my behavior and drawing conclusions. He is a simple organism. Voss said, simple and brilliant are not the same thing. I said, he can read another creature's emotional state better than most humans. He can tell when something is calm and when something is not. Right now he is reading me as calm, so he is calm. I find that remarkable. The amber pulse slowed. You find him remarkable. I find him extraordinary. I said, he has been alone and frightened and hungry, and the first time something came along and offered him warmth, he took it completely, without condition, without suspicion, without any memory of how badly things have gone before getting the way of his decision to trust again. I have met very few people who can do that. Voss processed this. The bioluminescent wave moved slowly up its body again, and this time when it reached the top, it did not fade. It held there, that pale blue light sitting steady at the top of its rigged head, pulsing at the exact rhythm of a heartbeat. What you are describing, the translator finally said, is a kind of strength. Yes, I said, it is. Your species produces this regularly when we are at our best. I said, yes, we are not always at our best, but the capacity is. There, Voss looked at me for another long moment, then it looked at the city. Around us, the dark buildings, the empty road, the fires on the horizon. It looked at all of it with the attention of something that has seen a great many things in a great many places, and then it looked back at me, standing in the middle of all this wreckage with a rifle in my hands and a dog on my boot. You are aware, it said, that your species' conventional defenses would not stop. What follows a scout report, I am aware. I said, and yet you are calm, and yet I am calm, I agreed. The white silver thread came back through the amber. It moved slowly, running through the whole of Voss's visible surface before fading. Marcus Webb, the translator, said it was the first time it had used my name, and the pronunciation was as strange as everything else, but the name was there. Intact, yes, I said, you are representative of your species. I thought about this, representative of what we can be, I said, on a good day. The bioluminescence pulsed once, bright and full and complex, running every color I had seen in the last 2 hours, in a single cascading wave from head to foot and back again. Then Voss went still, and I stood in the dark with my rifle up and biscuit on my boot, and the fires burned in the east, and somewhere far above us, through the smoke and the cloud and the vast dark distance between this road and the stars, something was waiting to hear what a scout had found. I thought about what report was being written right now, in whatever language the Vora used to talk to each other. I hoped I had given it something worth reporting. It happened without warning. One moment Voss was standing at 23 FT, its bioluminescence, in that quiet, steady state that I had begun to optimistically, it turned out, to read as something like neutral. The next moment it moved, and the speed of it was something that my eyes registered, but my brain had trouble fully accepting. I fired the first 2 rounds, caught its center mass as it closed the distance, and I heard the impact, felt it, more than heard it, a sound like hitting a concrete wall with a hammer, and the creature stumbled, not stopped, stumbled 1/2 step to the left, a correction in trajectory, and then it hit me like something that did not entirely understand the concept of stopping. I went into the side of the delivery truck hard enough that the world went white. For a full second, when it came back, I was on the ground. My rifle was not. My hands, the back of my skull was ringing, and I could feel 2 specific places on my left side where something had gone wrong. Not immediately agonizing, but that deep structural wrongness that you feel before the pain catches up when your body is still processing the information and running its damage report. Ribs, 2 of them, maybe 3. I rolled, not because I thought about rolling, there was not time to think, but because my body made the decision independently, and I agreed with it a fraction of a second after the fact. I rolled left away from where I had been, which was good because the place I had been was no longer available. A limb came down where my head had been and put a crater in the road surface. I got to my hands and knees. I found the rifle by feel 2 feet to my right, and I grabbed it and brought it up, and I fired twice more in the direction of the largest moving shape front of me. The rounds hit, I could tell, because Voss made a sound, the first purely physical sound I had heard from it, nothing to do with the translator. Short, sharp exhalation that was not pain exactly, but was the sound of something that has just been reminded That the world can surprise it. It turned toward me. Biscuit was barking. I did not look at him. I could not afford to look at him. I kept my eyes on Voss. And I got to my feet, and I put the rifle on it, and I said through the blood I could now taste at the back of my throat. Stop, the translator said. Nothing. Voss stopped. It was standing 8 ft from me now. At this distance, the scale of it was something you could not capture in briefing photos or file descriptions. It filled the space between the truck and the concrete barrier completely. Its head was above the level of my reach. The limb that had come down on the road was still braced against the asphalt, and I could see now that the knuckle structure of it was dense and armored, each joint a separate layer of overlapping natural armor that moved independently. My 2 ribs or 3 made a very specific complaint when I breathed. Anyway, I told you I would fire, I said. The translator was slow when it spoke. The word it produced was one I had not heard from it before. The word was resistance. Yes, I said. You were hit. It said yes. You rose. Yes. The bioluminescence on its body was doing something I had not seen in 2 hours of observation. It was fragmented, not running in clean waves, but broken into small disconnected patches that pulsed out of sync with each other, like a system running multiple competing processes at the same time. It was, I thought, what it looked like when something was genuinely processing something new. In previous encounters, Voss said, the species responded to physical contact by stopping. I repeated, ceasing. The translator amended. They did not continue. I understood what it was saying. We are not them, I said. Biscuit was still barking, and the sound of it, that absurd, completely fearless bark. Medium-sized dog taking on the most dangerous thing in the galaxy through sheer indignation was the most grounding sound I had ever heard in my life. I wanted to tell him to stop, to stay quiet, to stay safe. I did not, because he was being braver than any briefing had a right to expect, and I was not going to be the one to silence that. Voss looked at Biscuit. Biscuit barked directly at it. Once, a third time that was slightly more emphatic than the first 2. The Voorhees bioluminescence went through full complex cycle in about 4 seconds, and then settled into something I had never seen on it before, a dim silver green pulse, very slow, very steady, like something processing a large amount of information one piece at a time. The animal, Voss said, it is also not stopping. No, I said, he is not. It is aware of what I am. He is aware that you are large and that I am hurt. I said, he has decided those are both problems, and he is addressing both of them in the only way he knows how. The translator was quiet for a long time. Then, by making noise, by being present, I said, by not going anywhere, by letting you know that there are 2 of us here, and both of us are still here, and neither of us intends to become otherwise. Something in the bioluminescence changed. At that, not the color, the rhythm. It slowed and it deepened, and the silver green went a shade that I did not have a name for, and the whole effect was of something that had encountered a concept for the first time and was sitting with it very quietly. I kept the rifle up. My ribs were very loud now. The pain had arrived the way it always does, not all at once, but in stages. First as heat, then as pressure, then as something that made every inhale a small negotiation. I did my mathematics. I had 4 rounds Left in this magazine, one spare. Magazine in my sidearm, the rounds were, as the briefings had noted, limited in effect on Vorai dermal armor. I had just put 4 into Voss, and the main result was that it had taken a half step to one side and then continued. Coming, limited, not none, that was still the math I was working with. Why did you attack? I asked. Voss's head tilted. Testing, the translator said. You attacked me to test my response. Confirmation of data, it said. Observation was incomplete. Behavior under threat assessment requires direct data collection. I stared at it. You hit me to see what I would do. Yes, and what did I do? You rose, it said again. Word had a different quality this time. Not a statement, but something more like a conclusion being reached in real time. You fired again. You maintained the objective. The pattern on its body shifted. All 4 species observed before yours ceased functioning or fled upon the first direct physical contact. With a Vorai, the data was consistent across 4 separate encounters, and now it is not consistent. I said. Nova says it is not. I thought about that, about being the first thing in the galaxy to get hit by a Vorkai and then stand back up and tell it that was not going to be the end of the story about what that data point looked like in whatever system the Vorai used to classify the things it encountered. I also thought about the fact that Voss had tested me by physically striking me, and that this meant it was operating on a logic I needed to understand better. Was it only a test, I asked, or were you also trying to remove me from between you and the dog? The bioluminescent pattern fragmented again briefly before resolving. Then both, the translator said. The objectives were compatible. They were not compatible, I said, because I got back up. Correct, Voss said. They were not compatible. There was something in the quality of that answer that I spent a moment examining, not its content, its tone. The translator was limited, I knew, but even through the mechanical flatness of it, there was something in the pacing of Voss's speech that had changed since before the strike, something that might in a human have been called chastened, not apologetic. The Vorai, I suspected, did not have a framework for apology any more than they had a framework for thing I was doing when I stood between biscuit and danger, but chastened in the very specific sense of an intelligent creature that has done something and received information that it did not anticipate and is now revising its model. You expected me to stop, I said. Yes, you expected that the direct data collection would confirm what the previous 4 species showed you. Yes. And instead, I said, it gave you completely different data. Yes, Voss said, and then I do not have a classification category for what you did. I exhaled carefully, managing the ribs. Welcome to the human experience, I said. We spend a significant amount of time without a classification category. For what we are doing, we do it anyway. The silver-green bioluminescence ran long, slow wave up the full length of Voss's body. When it reached the top, it held there steady and pale like moonlight on water. Biscuit had stopped barking at some point in the last few minutes. He had moved from behind my legs to beside them, pressed up against my right shin, sitting with his front paws together, looking at Voss with an expression of complete focused attention, not fear, just attention. The way a dog looks at something it has decided it needs to keep very close track of. Voss looked back at him. He came forward, the translator said, while The assessment was occurring. He moved toward the confrontation, not away. He is a dog, I said. He did not calculate the outcome. He saw that I was in a difficult situation, and he moved toward me. That is what they do. The small creature moved toward Avore, Voss said. The translator could not convey tone, but the repetition itself was conveying something. It was turning the fact over, looking at it from different angles, not away, not because it could fight. Because you were there. Yes, I said. Exactly, because I was there, not for any reason he could articulate or explain, just because I was there and he had decided I was his. The bioluminescence bloomed full and sudden and complex, every color I had seen in the last 3 hours cascading across Voss's body in a sequence that lasted 4 or 5 seconds before settling into something quieter. I watched it happen, and I kept my rifle up and I breathed through my broken ribs and I waited. This behavior, Voss said finally, the protecting of the weak, the small organism advancing toward danger, you staying when staying serves no logical purpose. Yes, I said, is this common? I thought about how to answer that. I thought about the truth, which was complicated. No, it was not always common. Humanity was not always at its best. People left each other behind in all kinds of situations every single day, but also, yes, it was a real thing. It was a thing that happened. It was a thing that people chose sometimes, without knowing why, sometimes in the middle of the night in a dead city with 2 broken ribs, for no better reason than that a dog had pressed a cold nose against their hand. Uncommon enough to be remarkable, I said, common enough to be who we are. The translator processed this for a very long time, long enough that I shifted my weight, redistributing the load across my feet, managing the ribs, long enough that Biscuit looked up at me once, checking, and I looked down at him for 1 second, and in that second his tail moved one slow sweep left and right before he looked back at Voss. Marcus Webb, the translator, said. Still here, I said. I struck you. It said. You rose, you maintained your position, you did not abandon the animal. The pattern on its body shifted to something low and even and steady. I do not have a word for this in my language. My translator is searching for one in yours. I waited. The closest approximation it produces, Voss said, is integrity. I stood in the road with my rifle on the most dangerous creature in the known galaxy, and Biscuit pressed against my leg, and somewhere behind the smoke the first pale suggestion of dawn was beginning at the very edge of the sky. That will do, I said. The dawn came slowly, the way it does in cities that are not functioning without the ambient light of signs and windows and traffic to compete with. The sky went through its transitions more clearly than I had seen in years. Gray first, then a dark blue that was almost violet, and then the orange-pink that crept up from the east and mixed badly with the smoke from the fires until the whole horizon looked like something that should have been beautiful but was not quite. Voss had not moved since producing the word, neither had I. The morning light changed the way it looked. The bioluminescence that had been vivid and readable in the dark became subtler. Now not gone, but competing with actual light, visible only as a faint iridescence when it moved, like oil on water, without the dramatic visual display to read. I was operating on translator output and the rhythm of its breathing, which I had spent the night learning the way you learn anything in a situation where knowing it might keep you alive. Its breathing had changed in the last hour, slower, more deliberate. Either it was managing something, the equivalent of a calming exercise, which was an extraordinary thought, or its biology operated differently in daylight conditions. I filed both possibilities and decided not to act on either. My ribs had not improved. If anything, they had made their presence known more comprehensively in the last hour, as the adrenaline of the early standoff burned down and the reality of the structural damage became clearer. I could breathe without producing an audible sound, which I was taking as a positive indicator. I had known men who could not do that after taking a Vorei strike, and that category of man was by definition not someone I could ask. Biscuit had eaten a protein bar from my vest. Pocketed, I had not planned to give it to him. I had not planned anything past the moment of finding him under the drug. But at some point in the night, he had stood on his back legs, pressed his paws against my vest, and looked at me with the specific, articulate expression of an animal communicating a simple and urgent biological fact. I had given him the bar and watched him eat it in 4 rapid bites, while Voss observed the entire exchange with an attention that I was beginning to recognize as its default state for anything involving Biscuit. The creature was fascinated by the dog. I had no more precise word for it. The quality of its attention when Biscuit moved or made a sound or interacted with me was different from the quality of its attention when it focused on me alone. The me-focused attention was analytical, the careful, methodical observation of something, trying to build a complete picture. The Biscuit-focused attention was something else, something that did not have a military analog I could reach for, something that might, if I were very generous with my interpretations, be called wonder. You gave it food from your own supplies. Voss said it was not a question. He was hungry. I said you are also hungry. It said it was right, though I had not mentioned it and I had not eaten. Yes, I said, you gave him your food rather than keeping it. He had not eaten in longer than I have, I said. The math was straightforward. The pale iridescence moved across Voss's body in a long, slow wave. You calculate the needs of others before your own needs. Sometimes, I said, when the situation calls for it. This is a pattern, the translator said, not an exception. I thought about how to respond to that. For some of us, I finally said, yes. For some of us it is a pattern. Voss was quiet for a while. Then, the species I have previously observed did not exhibit this. They competed for resources even under threat, even when cooperation would have extended survival time. We do that too, I said. We are not simple, no. It agreed. You are not. The morning light strengthened somewhere behind us. A bird called, the first one I had heard since the night before, tentatively checking whether the world was accepting visitors again. Biscuit heard it too, his ears tracking the sound with automatic precision, but he did not move. He was leaning against my right leg, and he had decided that leaning against my right leg was where he needed to be, and he was not going to compromise that position for a bird. I shifted the rifle slightly. My arms had been holding the same position for most of the night, and the muscles in my shoulders were sending me detailed reports about their opinion of this. I managed the adjustment without losing the sight picture. You are in pain, Voss observed. Yes, you do not show it. I Show it, I said, you just do not know what it looks like on a human face yet. A pause. Teach me, the translator said. I almost lowered the rifle. Not because of the instruction, not because it was an order or demand, but because the request itself was so entirely unexpected that my body responded before my training could override it. I caught the movement before it completed, and I brought the rifle back to position, and I looked at Voss across 8 ft of morning light. You want me to teach you to read human expressions? I said. If the data exchange is to be accurate, it said. Understanding the information transfer mechanisms of the observed species increases accuracy. That is a very careful way to say yes, I said. Iridescence moved, the almost amusement pattern again. I was getting better at recognizing it, a tightness at the edges of the eyes, I said, a slight elevation of the shoulders, not much, just degree or two. The way the breath pattern shortens, the way the jaw sets. I paused. You are probably reading bioelectric signatures better than any of those visual signals anyway. Your bioelectric output has been elevated consistently since the physical contact. Voss said it is within a range that correlates in human physiological data. With pain management, you have human physiological data. I said. The transmissions your species has broadcast since our arrival include a significant quantity of medical and biological information. It said. Your species communicates a great deal of information about itself continuously. We are not very private, I said. No, Voss agreed. You are not. Another silence. Biscuit sneezed again, still startling himself, still recovering his composure with the same dignified urgency as before, and Voss tracked the movement with the same quality of attention it always gave him. Can I ask you something? I said. You may ask, Voss said. I will determine whether to answer. Fair enough. I adjusted my weight again. Why Biscuit specifically? You have been observing him differently from how you observe me. You are curious about him in a way that is different from how you are curious about me. Translator took a long time, longer than usual, long enough that I wondered whether the question had crossed some line I could not see. Then Voss said, on the 14 worlds where we have operated across 4 species, we have never encountered an organism that chose to advance toward a Vorkai rather than away from it. Biscuit did not choose, I said. He responded. It is not the same. He responded by advancing. Voss said. Every instinct in an organism his size and type would indicate retreat when faced with a Vorai threat display. He did not retreat. He moved toward the threat, toward you, because of there, I said. Because you were there, Voss said. And the way the translator said it, slowly with a weight on each word, told me that this was the part it could not place. Not the animal's courage exactly, but the reason for it, the fact that a creature could override the deepest programming of its own biology because something it was attached to was nearby and potentially in danger. He loves me, I said. It was the simplest way to say it, and I had spent enough of the night being precise that I thought the simplest way was earned. The translator processed for a very long time. Love it, said at last. Yes, we have a translation for this word, Voss said. We have encountered it in your broadcast transmissions. We have observed it referenced in your communications. We have been unable to produce a working operational definition that is consistent across contexts in which your species applies it. That is, because there is not one, I said it. Looks different in every context, what a soldier feels for a unit, what a parent feels for a child, what Biscuit feels. For me, what I feel for Biscuit, these are all called the same word, and they are all genuinely different things, and they are all genuinely the same thing. We are not consistent about it, we are just consistent about the fact that it matters more than almost anything else. Voss was quiet, then it overrides survival instinct regularly, I said it. Overrides rational self-interest. Constantly, I said, it caused you to stand between a Vorka and an unrelated animal for an entire night with broken structural bones and an inadequate weapon. Yes, I said. A pause so long that the bird called again twice, and another one answered it from somewhere further away, and the city around us sounded for 3 seconds like a place where ordinary things happened. Marcus Webb's. The translator said, yes, I have been assigned to observe this planet and report. Voss said, my function is assessment, classification, determining whether a species and its world require further engagement from my collective. No, I said, the assessment as of this moment, Voss said, is incomplete. Incomplete, I repeated, the species, Voss said slowly, does not fit the existing classification structures. It is not prey, it is not neutral, it is not a threat in any recognized form. It does not respond to stimuli in predicted ways. The iridescence ran its full body. Wave again, slow and complex, the animal. It domesticated advanced toward me. The soldier it damaged rose and raised his weapon. The soldier he damaged gave his food to the animal. A pause. These are not behaviors that our models account for. I let out a slow breath. Does that mean something? I asked for the report. Voss looked at me. The morning light was full now, clear and cool, and in it the Voray was less terrifying than it had been in the dark, not because it was smaller or less capable, but because in actual daylight detail emerged. I could see the structure of its natural armor more clearly, the way it jointed and overlapped and moved with it. I could see that its head shape at a certain angle had something I could only call a profile, a shape that suggested an individual face rather than just a predator's head. I could see the faint moving iridescence of the bioluminescence that had not quite shut off in the morning light. It was extraordinary. I had been standing 3 hours away from something extraordinary, and I had kept my rifle on it for every minute of those 3 hours, and somewhere in all of that I had started to see it as something closer to a person than a threat, not safe, not harmless, but a person. The report, Voss said finally, will not recommend immediate further engagement. Something in my chest loosened carefully around the ribs, but genuinely, thank you. I said, it is not a gift. Voss said, it is accurate data. Your species has presented variables that require additional observation time. A recommendation of engagement would be premature. I will take it, I said. Biscuit stood up, stretched the full elaborate back-arching stretch of a dog that is rested and is now ready for whatever comes next, and then looked up at me. His tail was moving, not the slow single sweep of the night, real proper wag back and forth in the morning light. I looked at him, I looked at Voss. I am going to lower my rifle now, I said. I'm telling you in advance because I decided at some point tonight that I was going to be honest with you about everything I did and why, and I am going To keep doing that, noted the translator said. I lowered the rifle, slowly keeping my eyes on Voss the whole time, keeping my posture open and my breathing even in my hands in the positions where they were visible and their movement was readable. Voss did not move. I let the rifle hang at my side and I stood in the morning light, with my broken ribs and my dog and my empty road, and the most dangerous scout in the galaxy looked at me across 8 ft of quiet air and said nothing, and the silence this time was a completely different kind of silence from the one I had walked into the night before. This silence had room in it. The second strike came from a direction I had not expected, and that was my fault. I had spent the night learning Voss. I had mapped its movement patterns, cataloged its bioluminescent states, developed a working vocabulary of its physical language, built a model of how it operated, and that model in the clarity of the morning light had made me feel something that I should have known better than to feel not safe. I was not stupid enough to feel safe, but settled. I had felt settled, and settled is what you feel right before something you did not see coming arrives. The second one dropped from the collapsed overpass, not Voss, a different Vorkai. It was slightly smaller, a word that is almost meaningless when you're talking about a creature of this size, since slightly smaller still meant 812 ft and a mass that the road registered audibly when it landed, but it was different from Voss in observable ways. Its bioluminescent pattern was a deep, fast red, strobing in rapid pulses rather than flowing in waves, and its posture when it landed was lower, more coiled, the posture of something that had not come down to observe. It had come down because the scout had been in the same location for too long without reporting a conclusion. It had come down to end the delay, and it went for Biscuit, not for me. Not initially. It had processed the scene the fraction of a second after landing, and it had identified the variable, the thing that was keeping the scout occupied, the reason the assessment had not been completed, the element that was complicating the situation, and it moved directly toward the gap under the delivery truck where Biscuit had spent most of the night. I moved faster than the ribs wanted me to. I put myself in the path of the second Vorkai before it had completed its second stride, which meant I was between it and Biscuit at the cost of being approximately 4 ft from something that had arrived in a state that translated across every species. As I am not here to talk, it stopped for 1/2 second. It stopped because I was in its path, and the path was more direct than going around me, and it was running its own model of whether I was going to be a problem. In that half-second, Voss spoke not to me, to the other one. What came out was the layered resonant vocalization of its own language, the real language, not the translated one, the one with multiple frequencies and its own echo, and it was intense enough that I felt it in my sternum, even standing to the side of it. The second Vorkai went still. I could not understand a word of it. I did not need to. The posture told me enough. Voss had moved. In the second, the other one appeared to a position that placed it between the new arrival and where I was standing. It had done it automatically without announcing the intention, the way you do something that comes from a decision that has already been made and does not need to be discussed. I registered that. I registered what it meant, and then I focused on the second Vorkai because it was still the more immediate problem. The exchange between them lasted about 40 seconds, short, intense bursts of that layered vocalization with the second Vorkai producing something lower and more insistent, and Voss responding with something that even untranslated had the quality of someone who has already reached a conclusion and is not interested in having it argued with. Then the second one went still. The red bioluminescence did not stop, but the strobing slowed, and the posture, that low, coiled readiness, shifted incrementally towards something closer to neutral. Voss turned to me. "This is my unit's forward element," it said through the translator. "It has been monitoring the assessment period remotely and has determined that the delay indicates compromised evaluation. It thinks you have been talking to me too long," I said. "It believes the subject has applied a behavioral manipulation strategy that has interfered with objective assessment." The translator said. "Has it?" I asked. "The iridescence ran its wave." "No," Voss said. "The subject has applied transparency, which is not manipulation. The distinction is relevant." I looked at the second Vorhi. It was looking at me with an intensity that had none of the curious quality I had learned to read in Voss. This was pure assessment, and the assessment it was running did not appear to have a category for me any more than Voss's original one had. But where Voss had responded to that gap with curiosity, this one was responding to it with something closer to impatience. "What is its name?" I asked. Translator produced the sound, different from Voss's, similarly untranslatable. "An approximation," I said after a moment. "It is a reduction, as mine was." "Ren," I said, and I looked directly at the second Vorkai, and I said, "My name is Marcus Webb. I have been here all night. I am not a manipulation strategy. I am a soldier who would not leave his dog." The translator relayed this. I watched Ren for the response. The bioluminescence did something specific, a single sharp pulse of white that came and went faster than any pattern I had seen on Voss. Then it looked at Biscuit. Biscuit looked back at it with the same focused, attentive expression he had eventually settled into with Voss, ears up, eyes tracking, chin slightly raised, not aggressive, just present. Ren looked at Biscuit for a long time, then it looked at Voss. Exchange that followed was shorter than the first one, 3 or 4 back-end, fourth bursts of the layered language, low and fast. When it ended, Ren took a single step back, then another. "What did you say to it?" I asked Voss. "I told it," the translator said, "to observe the animal." I looked at Ren, who was still watching Biscuit. Biscuit, who had not moved from his position beside my right leg, who was monitoring Ren the way he monitored everything, with complete attention and without visible fear, waiting to take his cue from me. "And I said," Ren asked why the animal does not respond to the threat display. "What did you answer?" I told it. Voss said slowly that I am still determining the answer, but that the answer, when I determine it, will be significant. The morning had fully arrived now. The fires in the east had burned lower, and the air smelled of smoke and wet concrete and the cold metal smell of a city that has been left running without anyone in it. Traffic signals somewhere nearby were still cycling through their sequence, red, green, yellow, red for an intersection that had not seen a vehicle in 2 days. Ren moved again, not forward, sideways, a slow lateral arc that I tracked with my eyes but did not pivot to follow, keeping my body square and my position between both of them and the truck behind me. It was moving to get a different angle on Biscuit, not a threat. Angle and observation angle, Biscuit. Tracked it with his ears, then he did. Something that I had not expected, and that based on the response of both Vori they had not expected either. He took 3 steps toward Ren, not running, not barking, just walking in that loose-jointed ground-covering trot that dogs use when they have decided to go investigate something interesting. He closed the distance between himself and the second Vorkai from 12 feet to about 5, and then he stopped and he sat down. And he looked up at Ren with the expression of a dog who has decided that this large and alarming thing is probably worth figuring out. Ren went completely still, the strobing red bioluminescence stopped. It did not turn off, but it stopped cycling. It held in place a deep even red, and the pattern, which had been quick and fractured, smoothed out into something longer and slower, the way Voss's amber had done in the early hours of the night when it shifted from threat assessment to something else. Ren, Voss said through the translator, and I could tell from the quality of the word that it was saying this for my benefit, translating something it had just observed. Has never approached a prey organism voluntarily. He is not prey. I said, no. Voss said, I know. Ren is learning that. Biscuit sniffed the air in Ren's direction, the specific rapid information gathering sniff of a dog, making a thorough sensory assessment. Then he looked back at me as though checking in. Are we okay? Is this fine? And I said quietly, you are all right, Biscuit. And he turned back to Ren and waited. The red bioluminescence shifted slowly, the way ice melts, not all at once, but in the sequence that heat dictates. The red cooled through a deep orange and settled into something closer to amber, the slow amber of the curious thing, the amber I had been reading on Voss since the 3rd hour. Ren lowered its body, not dramatically, just a degree or 2, the way you lean in when you want to look at something more closely without alarming it. Biscuit sneezed. I watched Ren process a dog sneezing from 3 ft away. I watched it, observed the small, undignified surprise of it, the autocorrection, the return to sitting position. I watched it observe that Biscuit, having sneezed in the presence of the second most dangerous thing currently on this road, was entirely untroubled by having done so. The amber held, then the translator, which I realized had been set to a rain that reached me even when Voss and Ren were speaking to each other, produced something I had not asked it to translate. It produced it in a tentative, uncertain way, as though it was not fully confident in the English equivalent. The word it produced was Gillas. I looked at Voss. Ren says the animal has no deception in it. Voss translated, everything it does is what it is. There is no secondary meaning. There is no strategy. What you observe is all that is right. Ren finds this, the translator said, cycling, disorienting. Most people do the first time they spend real time with a dog. I said. Voss was quiet for a moment. Then, your species domesticated this animal thousands of years ago. I said. You took a wild organism and you changed it across generations into something that chose to be near you, something that trusted you, something that approached what was dangerous because you were there. That is one way to describe it. I said. The other way is that the dog changed us at the same time. We are not the same species we were before we had them. The translator cycled, explain. It said the relationship made us different. I said. Living with something that trusted us completely, that read our emotions, that cared whether we were sad or frightened or alone, changed how we operated. We became more the kind of species that deserved to be trusted. Because something trusted us. Obligation made us better, a very long silence. Then Voss said you became something worthy of the trust by being trusted. Yes, I said, and the animal Voss said it became something capable of advancing toward a Vorkai because a human was there. He became brave, I said, because I was. He took his reading from me. He decided that if I was not afraid, there was probably a reason, and he chose to believe in the reason even though he could not see it. Ren had not moved in several minutes. It was still crouched at its observation angle, watching Biscuit with the amber bioluminescence slow and steady across its body. Biscuit had not moved either. He was still sitting, his front paws neat together, his eyes tracking between the two Vorai with a patience that I found remarkable, given that he had eaten exactly one protein bar in the last several. Marcus Webb Voss said, yes. The report I send will contain a recommendation. It said I informed you earlier that the recommendation would not support immediate engagement. I want to be precise about what it will say. I waited. It will say that this species has developed a relational structure with another organism that has produced mutual behavioral modification. Voss said it will say that the soldier protecting his animal demonstrated properties not observed in any of the 4 previously encountered sea species. It will say that the animal in turn demonstrated properties not observed in any organism of its type and scale. And what will you recommend based on that? I ask that my collective treat your species not as a resource or a threat, Voss said, but as a subject of study. That engagement protocols be revised to account for the fact that this species may not respond to standard approaches. That a period of non-engagement be maintained while the study is ongoing. I breathed through my ribs. How long is the study period? By your calendar, Voss said. A minimum of 100 years. 100 years. I thought about what that meant. I thought about the evacuated cities and the empty roads and the fires on the horizon. 100 years of the Vorai collective keeping its distance, treating humanity as a puzzle worth taking time with rather than a situation worth resolving quickly. That is a significant concession. I said it is an accurate assessment. Voss said what we have observed in the last night requires more data before conclusions can be drawn. Reaching conclusions without sufficient data would compromise the integrity of the report. Is that the only reason? I asked. The bioluminescent wave ran the full length of Oz's body. Slow, complex, all the colors I had mapped over the course of the night in sequence. No, the translator said. I let that answer be what it was. Ren made sound, not the full layered vocalization of Vorkai language, but something shorter, quieter, directed downward toward the small shape sitting patiently 3 ft below its attention. Biscuit cocked his head to one side, the full degree it would go, his ears swiveling forward. Then his tail began to move, not the slow single sweep. The full wag committed an ongoing physical expression of a dog who has made his assessment, and his assessment is this is okay. This is something I can be around. This, whatever it is not what I was afraid of. I watched the most dangerous advanced scout in the known galaxy process being wagged at. I stored the image. I wanted to be able to Describe it accurately later, when there was a later to describe things in the red bioluminescence on Ren's body. Completed its final transition, it settled into the same quiet amber as Voss, steady and slow, a pulse like a heartbeat moving across its body with the rhythm of something that has stopped assessing and started simply being. Present, 2 soldier, 1 dog, 1 morning full of smokes and bird calls, and the cycling traffic signals for an empty intersection, and underneath all of it, like the concrete below the asphalt, like the bedrock below the concrete, the simple and extraordinary fact of a small, hungry, trusting creature who had walked toward an apex predator because a man he believed in was there and whose tail was now going at full speed because the apex predator had crouched down to look at him more carefully. What happens now? I asked. Voss considered this. Now the translator said we wait for Ren to finish its assessment. We looked at Ren. Ren was looking at Biscuit. Biscuit was looking back. The tail was still going. Ren's assessment took 20 minutes, I know, because I counted not the full count, not seconds, but the rough time passages. I had been running all night, intervals that let me keep track of a night that had stretched past any reasonable definition of 20 minutes. Of Ren crouched at its observation angle, watching Biscuit with the steady amber bioluminescence of something no longer in threat mode, something that was doing something far more unusual for a Vorei, something that was, in so far as I could read it, simply looking, not assessing, not calculating, doing the thing that some creatures do when they encounter another creature that is so entirely itself, so completely without performance or strategy that you stop trying to classify it and simply observe it the way you might look at a clear river and not think about the water, but just watch it move. Biscuit, for his part, had decided after the first 5 minutes that if Ren was going to crouch there without making any alarming moves, he was going to take the opportunity to lie down. He did so with the full ceremony of a dog who has been sitting for too long, the slow lower the front paws extended, the chin on the ground, the tail making one final sweep before going still. He kept his eyes on Ren, but his body language very clearly said, I am watching, but I am also comfortable. It was, I thought, the most ambassadorial thing I had ever witnessed. Voss stood to my left and slightly behind me during Ren's observation, not close enough to be a physical presence in my space, but close enough that its translator would carry between us. It said very little during those 20 minutes. At one point it said, Ren was trained for 5 years before being assigned to a scout unit. In that training it faced the most extreme conditions available. It has never looked at anything the way it is looking at this animal. What is the closest comparison? I asked. Voss considered. There is no close comparison, it said. I nodded. That seemed about right. When Ren finally rose, a slow, deliberate movement, full height, its bioluminescence cycling through transition I had not seen before, going from amber to a clear pale gold. Biscuit lifted his head, his tail moved once. Then he looked at me, checking in. All right, I told him quietly, you did well. His tail went twice, then he put his chin back on his paws. Ren spoke to Voss. The exchange was longer this time. Not heated but thorough, the way conversation is when both parties are trying to be precise about something complex. I waited. My ribs had settled into a dull, continuous complaint that was background noise now, something I was managing rather than fighting. When the exchange ended, Voss turned to me. Ren has completed its assessment. The translator said it willed a separate report to the collective, different from yours. I asked. Additional to mine, Voss said. A second observation said adds weight the collective values. Corroborating data, what will Ren's report say? The iridescence moved slowly across Voss's body. Ren will say that it observed an organism of minimal physical capability willingly approach an apex predator and maintain a position of proximity for an extended period without distress. It will say that the organism's behavior was not explained by any current model. It will recommend that the behavioral data set be flagged for collective-wide attention. That sounds significant. I said it is significant. Voss said Ren does not recommend collective-wide flags. Frequently, I looked at Ren. Ren was still watching Biscuit. Biscuit was watching Ren. Your collective, I said. How many are there? The question is complex. Voss said we do not use a number in the way you mean. Many, I said, or few. Many, the translator said. What you would call many, and they will all receive these reports. Yes, I thought about that, about a report too. Reports going out to whatever Vorkai collective looked like across however much of the galaxy they occupied, about that report containing the data of a night in a dead city where a soldier stood between an apex predator and his dog and did not move, about what happened when beings that had observed 14 worlds, 4 species and countless encounters read a report that said the 5th species was different. Voss, what were they like? I asked. The 4 species before us. A long pause. The kind that tells you the answer is being chosen carefully. They were, Voss said. Finally, afraid not as a failure. Fear is reasonable. The Vorkai threat display is designed to produce fear. It has always produced fear. They were afraid, and they acted in the ways that afraid things act. They ran or they froze or they attacked without strategy or they submitted. All of these are rational responses to the information their senses were providing. But I said, but they did not do what you did, Voss said. None of them placed themselves between the scout and something they were protecting. None of them stayed. None of them spoke to the scout as though the scout was someone to be spoken to. The iridescence moved. You treated me as an individual from the first moment. You gave me a name. You told me yours was that unusual. I asked. The other species produced vocalizations, Voss said. Distress signals, threat responses, communication attempts directed toward others of their kind, not toward the Vorkai. You directed your communication toward me specifically from the first words. I thought about that, about the instinct that had made me speak into the dark at an alien that might not understand a syllable of English. I had not done it as strategy. I had done it because talking, directing words at the problem you are facing rather than past. It is simply what I do when things get difficult. It is what I was taught and what 22 years had reinforced, and what the particular silence of that road at that moment had demanded. I was raised to talk to people. I said, when something is in front of you, you address it. You do not talk past it. You do not pretend it is not there. I paused. I did not know if you could understand me. I decided that was less important than trying. Yes, Voss said. That decision, that is the thing that None of the others did. They did not. Try the pale gold bioluminescence on. Ren had deepened slightly during this exchange, moving toward a warm, steady tone that sat somewhere between amber and copper. It had also gradually, without any dramatic announcement, moved somewhat closer to Biscuit. Not close enough to crowd him, but closer than they. 5T of the observation angle, 3 FT now. Maybe 2 and 1 2. Biscuit had not moved. His tail, however, had started moving. Again Ren lowered its head, the full body movement of a much larger creature, choosing to bring itself to a different level, the way you do when you want to better look at something small, and it made that sound again, the short, quiet one that was not Vorai language in any formalized sense, not the layered collective communication, but something individual, something that was just Ren addressing something it was trying to understand. Biscuit's ears went forward at maximum extension. Then Biscuit did the thing that dogs do when they have decided. He raised himself on his front legs, stretched his neck forward, and sniffed. He sniffed Ren thoroughly, the way dogs are thorough, the rapid double inhale, the pause for processing, the single exhale, the second pass for the information that requires a second pass. He sniffed the hand, the limb, the armored knuckle structure at the end of it that Ren had slowly extended downward, and he processed what he found, and then he sat back down, and his tail went at full speed. Whatever he had smelled, he had approved of it. Ren went still for about 4 seconds. Then the pale gold bioluminescence ran its wave. Full body slow, complete, and at the top of the wave where it reached the ridges above what might have been a face, it briefly turned silver white and clear, and completely unlike any state I had seen on either of them before. What does that mean? I asked V quietly. The white. Voss was quiet for a moment. Then, we do not have a common word for it in Vorkai. We do not experience it often enough to have standardized it, but you know what it is? Yes, Voss said. Tell me. Another pause. The translator cycled through its frequencies before settling. The closest English approximation, Voss said, is moved. I looked at Ren, the forward element, the one that had descended to end the delay, the one whose red strobing bioluminescence had told me everything I needed to know about what kind of encounter this was going to be. Standing in the morning light with its head lowered and its gold bioluminescence going silver white at the peaks, because a dog had sniffed it. Because a hungry, tired, unbothered, guileless dog had decided it smelled interesting and had said so in the most direct way available to a creature that does not have language. Yes, I said, I know that feeling. We stood there, the 4 of us, in the middle of a road in an empty city for a few more minutes, without anyone saying anything. The traffic signals kept cycling. A third bird had joined the first 2. The fires in the east were smoke now, gray against the blue sky, the kind of smoke that tells you the crisis has passed, even if the aftermath has not. Ren eventually rose to its full height again. It looked at Voss. An exchange passed between them, short this time, almost gentle. Its brevity. Then Ren looked at me, and its bioluminescence was steady amber. Now the same as Voss's had been in the deep hours before dawn, and it held my gaze for a long moment before it turned. It went back the way it had come up the rubble of the overpass with that uncanny silence of something that does not need to announce its presence, and over the edge and gone. I watched it go. Will Ren Be all right, I asked. Voss tilted its head. All right, it seemed I tried to find the word affected. Yes, Voss said it will consider what affected it. For a long time, this is valuable for Ren. The iridescence moved slowly. We are not a species that is easily changed. Ren will carry what it observed. Here is that good. I believe, Voss said carefully, that it is good for us to carry things that change us. A pause. Sure would call this growth. Yes, I said. We would. Biscuit was looking in the direction Ren had gone. His head was tilted, his ears tracking the fading sound of its movement on the overpass. His expression the one dogs wear when something interesting has left the room, and they are deciding whether they are satisfied with the outcome. Apparently, he was, because he turned back to me, stood up, stretched again, and then looked at me with an expression of great clarity that said very plainly that he would like more food and would like to go somewhere that smelled better than this road. Biscuit wants to leave. I told Voss his read of the situation is accurate. Voss said, the assessment is complete. There is no further reason to remain at this location. No, I agreed. There isn't. I looked around for the first time in hours, and the way you look when you are checking the landscape rather than the threat in front of you. The road was long and straight and empty in both directions. The deliveries truck behind me had shifted slightly on its side during the night. I had not noticed, which told me how focused I had been, and the space Biscuit had sheltered in was barely visible now. Just a shadow under a tilted chassis. I thought about the support vehicle I had arrived in, which was 200 m south and flat. I thought about my radio, which had no signal. I thought about the column that had moved north 12 hours ago, which was presumably still moving north. I need to find a way out of this city, I said, on foot if necessary. It is not necessary, Voss said. I looked at it. What do you mean? Your communications infrastructure in this sector failed because of interference from our arrival equipment. The translator said that interference has been corrected as of this morning. Your radio should function. I reached for the radio on my vest. I had not tried it since the 3rd hour of the night, when the static had been solid enough to tell me clearly that nothing was getting through. I hit the transmit button. Static, then I carrier signal, faint but there. I tried the unit frequency. It took about 40 seconds, then a voice came back. Not my unit comms relay station to the north, but clear enough to matter. I gave my designation. I gave my location. I gave my status: 1 person walking wounded, 1 civilian non-combatant. I gave the road and the coordinates. The relay station confirmed transport would be dispatched. Estimated arrival 1 hour 20 minutes. I released the transmit button. I stood in the morning air, and I breathed through my ribs, and I looked at Voss and I said, thank you. The interference correction was already scheduled. The translator said, that is not what I am thanking you for, I said. The amber bioluminescence moved slowly, steadily, in a pattern that by now I knew, as well as my own handwriting. Marcus Webbit said, yes, when the report reaches the collective. Voss said, there will be questions, there will be a period of debate. The recommendation of a 100 red year non-engagement will be contested by those in the collective who do not agree. Will they win? I asked. I cannot predict the outcome of collective debate, it said. I can tell you that Ren's flag will carry weight, and I can tell you that the specific Data, the dog advancing the soldier. Rising, the exchange of names, the giving of food will be included verbatim. In the record, what does that mean? Practically, I asked, it means Voss said that the argument for giving your species time will have very specific, very detailed evidence behind it, and it means that whoever in the collective reviews that evidence will have to account for it when they argue the opposite position. I thought about that, about a detailed record of a night on a dead road in an empty city being reviewed by beings I could not imagine, in places I would never see, about the argument over humanity's fate hinging in some small but real way on the image of Biscuit walking 3 steps toward an apex predator and sitting down to have a look. Biscuit might have saved the world, I said. Voss considered. Biscuit provided the data that made the argument. It said the translation of that data into a recommendation was my function, and the translation of that recommendation into action will be the collective's function. I said yes, and we are just hoping that the collective looks at the data and reaches the right conclusion. Yes, Voss said. You are. I looked down at Biscuit, who was looking up at me with enormous patient eyes, still waiting for the food situation to be addressed. Then we had better make sure the next night years of data is as good as this one, I said. The bioluminescence did the thing I had spent the night learning to recognize, the quick silvery shift that was not in any of its other patterns, the one that had no standard Vorkai equivalent, the one the translator had decided to call amused and optimistic assessment. Voss said we are an optimistic species. I said when we are at our best. The amber wave ran its full course, slow and complete, from the ground to the ridges of its head and back. Then Voss said, Marcus Webb, I will remember this assessment period. So will I said. The animal, it said. Take care of it. Always, I said, and that was the last thing the translator said. Voss turned. Not quickly, not urgently, with the patient deliberateness of something that has decided what it is doing and does not need to hurry, and it moved north along the road, and it did not make a sound doing it, and within 30 seconds it had passed beyond the range of the scattered morning light and the ruins and the dead traffic signals, and was simply gone, the way very large and very quiet things go when the situation that brought them to a place has been resolved. I stood on the road and watched the place where it had been. Biscuit pressed against my leg. I reached down and put my hand on his head, and I felt him lean into it with the full weight of his trust, and I scratched his ears, and the smoke drifted, and the birds called, and 70 minutes later, transport came south along Route 9 and found a sergeant and a dog standing in the middle of an empty road, waiting with the specific patience of people who have already been through the longest night of their lives and come out the other side. The medic who climbed out of the transport looked at my ribs, looked at Biscuit, and looked at me. Sir, she said, where is your vehicle? Flat, I said. She took a second. And the dog coming with me, I said. She looked at him. He looked at her. His tail started moving. She looked back at me. Is he cleared for transport? He is now, I said. She had the good sense to simply nod and get out of his way as he climbed into the transport with the confidence of a dog who has already navigated worse. And I followed him, and the doors closed, and the transport headed north toward the rest of humanity, carrying a broken rib sergeant and one extraordinary dog, and a story that Neither of them would be able to fully explain for a very long time. The report would go out from Voss to the collective by whatever means the Vorkai used to communicate across the distances between stars. It would contain everything: the standoff, the exchange of names, the strike and the rising, the food given freely, the dog that walked forward, the dog that sneezed, the dog that sniffed an apex predator and found it interesting, the soldier who called himself Marcus Webb and did not move. All of it in a format that beings I could not imagine would read and debate and argue over in the months and years to come, but that was later. And for now, there was a transport heading north, and Biscuit's head was on my knee and my hand was on his ears, and outside the window, the city we were leaving behind was quiet and empty and waiting, like every good story, for what happened next. 6 months later, a woman named Lena Marsh called me from a government office I had never heard of in a building that, as far as I could tell, did not appear on any public map of the city it was located in. She said she had read the report I filed the morning after the incident in Harlow. She said she had a number of questions. She said the questions were important and time sensitive, and she hoped I would be willing to meet with her at my earliest convenience. I was in a recovery facility at the time, 3 weeks out from surgery to properly address what had turned out to be 3 cracked ribs and a hairline fracture in a 4th. Biscuit was with me. There had been a brief and somewhat spirited conversation with the facility administration about whether this was acceptable, and then it was accepted because the alternative was that I did not stay, and I was apparently needed for the recovery program, and Biscuit had the kind of face that made the administrator who came to argue the point simply change her mind midway through her first sentence. I told Lena Marsh I would meet her when I was mobile. She arrived 2 days later, told me something about her definition of at my earliest convenience. She was younger than I expected, which is what I always think when I meet people who have significant authority. They are always younger than expected, because at a certain point in your career you stop updating your mental image of what powerful people look like, and it gets stuck at whatever the people in power looked like when you were 23. She had dark hair and the kind of posture that comes from spending long periods of time on your feet in front of rooms full of people who are not necessarily happy to see you. She sat across from me in the small garden outside the facility, where Biscuit had immediately determined that the interesting smells were along the left wall, and she put a very thin folder on the table between us and looked at me for a moment before saying anything. I want to be clear about what this meeting is, she said. It is not a debrief in any formal sense. Your debrief was thorough, and the record is complete. This is something different. What is it? I asked. It is a conversation, she said, about what happens next. She opened the folder. Inside was a single document. Not my report, something else with a header I could not read at the angle she had placed it, and a line of text below it that was clearly in a different language, not any language I recognized. The characters were not from any alphabet I had ever seen in the briefings that arrived. She said 4 weeks after the Harlow incident. It came through a transmission channel that your unit's equipment was not designed to receive, and it took us 3 weeks to even confirm we had received it, and another 4 days to begin translating it. We have Been translating it in sections since. Then, what is it? I said as best we can. Determined, Lena Marsh said, it is a protocol document, something like a formal proposal. It sets out terms for a period of non-engagement between the Vori Collective and Earth. She paused. The minimum term specified in the document is 100 years. I looked at the document. I thought about Voss standing on a dead road in the morning light, saying by your calendar a minimum of 100 years. Does the document say why? I asked the relevant section. She said took the longest to translate because it contains references we have no direct equivalent for. The translators are describing the main justification as something like, and they stress this is approximate, a period of behavioral study to be conducted on the basis of anomalous observational data collected during the initial contact assessment. Anomalous observational data, I said. Yes, what specifically? She turned the folder around and pushed it toward me. At the bottom of the main document, below several sections of untranslated characters, was a paragraph in English. Rough English, the way text looks when it has been translated through multiple systems before anyone competent gets to look at it, but readable. It said the basis of this proposal is the following. Observed anomaly during contact assessment at location Harlow. The subject species produced behavioral data inconsistent with all prior contact records. Specifically, one member of the species maintained protective position over a domesticated animal for a period exceeding 8 of the planet's hours in direct proximity to contact unit under conditions that in prior contact records have universally produced cessation of behavioral capacity. The same member of the species sustained physical contact from a contact unit and resumed defensive position. The domesticated animal, an organism of minimal physical capacity, voluntarily advanced toward the contact unit on 2 separate occasions. These behaviors are not accounted for by current models. A study period of a minimum of 100 years is therefore proposed, during which the collective will suspend active engagement with this planet and its species pending completion of additional observational data. I read it twice. Then I put it down and looked at Lena Marsh. They're telling us, I said, that they will leave us alone for 100 years because a dog walked up to them. And because you did not move, she said. Yes, that is the short version. I sat back outside the fence. The city was doing what cities do when the crisis has passed and the people have come back in. The lights are on again, being ordinary, loud, continuous, alive in the way it had not been for the 6 weeks of the evacuation. Traffic sound, voices, radio from somewhere down the street, playing something with a strong bass line. What does the government want to do with this information? I asked. That, Lena Marsh said, is what this conversation is about. She was quiet for a moment, which told me she had thought carefully about how to say that to the next part. It there are people in several governments, she said, who want to use the 100 years to prepare a military response, to build capacity, to develop weapons that are effective against Voriurmal armor. She paused. There are other people who believe we should use the 100 years differently. How differently? I asked to understand them. She said to study the language, to attempt to build something that looks more like what happened on that road in Harlow, a conversation, and less like what it was technically a precursor to, which Was a standoff, I said, which was from a certain angle, she said, the most successful diplomatic encounter in human history conducted by a sergeant and a dog. Biscuit had finished his investigation of the left wall and returned and was now sitting under the garden table looking at Lena Marsh with his evaluative expression. She looked at him. He held the look for 3 or 4 seconds, decided she was acceptable, and then put his chin on her foot. She looked down at him and then up at me. Does he do this with everyone? She asked. He does it when he decides someone is trustworthy, I said. He has not been wrong yet. She was quiet for a moment. Sergeant Webb, I am going to be direct with you. The reason I am here is that the people who want to build on what happened at Harlow, the conversation, rather than the weapons, need someone who has actually had the conversation, who knows what it felt like, what worked, what did not, who can teach other people how to be the thing you were on that road. I was the thing I have always been, I said. I did not do anything unusual. You stood between an apex predator and a dog for 8 hours, she said. That is not a strategy, I said. That is just what you do. Yes, she said. That is exactly what I mean. I looked at her. I thought about the briefings I had read 6 months ago about the 4 species that were not there anymore. I thought about what Weiss had said about them, afraid, running, freezing, submitting, responding to the information their senses were giving them with the responses that information demanded, all of it rational, all of it catastrophically insufficient. I thought about what had been different, not courage in any heroic sense. Courage is the wrong word for something that was not about overcoming fear, but about deciding that the fear was less important than the thing behind you, about having something at your back that mattered enough to make the front of you irrelevant. Can I ask you something? I said. Yes, Lena Marsh said. If the 100 years works, if it leads to something real, something that goes beyond the study period and becomes an actual relationship between our species and the Vore, how much of that will come down? She looked at the dog. He had not moved from her foot. His tails made a slow sweep across the flagstones. All of it, she said, in the sense that the chain of causation runs directly through him. You stay because of him. The encounter goes a certain way because you stay. Voss sends the report because the encounter goes that way. Wren flags it collective-wide because of what it observes him do. He just wanted to know what Wren smelled like. I said. Yes, she said. And that curiosity, that uncalculated, genuine, weaponized by pure accident curiosity, is, according to our translation team, the specific data point in Wren's individual report that most confounded the Voorhees existing models. I looked at Biscuit. He looked back at me. His ears were slightly forward. His tail was level. His expression was the one he wore when he was watching me and waiting for information about what we were doing next. Here is what I want to tell you, I said to him, in case it is ever translated and he finds out. Lena Marsh raised an eyebrow. He came from a dead city, I said, not to her but in the way you say things out loud, because they are true and they deserve to exist in air rather than only in your head. He was lost and hungry and alone in a place that had stopped caring about things like him, and the first time someone offered him a hand, he pressed his nose against it, and then when an apex predator showed up, he did not run. He walked toward it. He sniffed it. His tail went. I paused. That is it, that is. The whole of the story. He just kept trusting over and over in conditions where trusting was the most outrageous possible choice, and the trusting changed everything. Biscuit lifted his head off Lena Marsh's foot, looked at me, and then stood up and put his chin on my knee instead. I put my hand on his head. The city was loud and alive outside the fence. All right, I said to Lena Marsh, tell me what you need. She opened the folder again. There were more pages behind the translated documents I recognize now as the kind that represent the beginning of a new category of work, the kind that do not have established forms yet because the work itself has never existed before. We are calling the program the Harlow Initiative. She said the official description is a research and communication project aimed at building the language, methodology, and diplomatic protocols for future contact with the Vori Collective. The unofficial description is figuring out what I did right, I said, and what we can teach. She said, yes. How many people? Currently 12. The goal is 40 by the end of the first year. What kind of people? She looked at me steadily. The kind who would stand on a road for 8 hours, she said. The kind who stay. We have been finding it surprisingly difficult to assess for this quality using standard evaluation metrics. A pause. You may be able to help with that. I thought about what that quality was actually if you tried to name it precisely. Not bravery. Exactly, not stubbornness, though that was part of it. Not love, though that was what had started it. Something in the overlap between all three. Something that activated when the thing behind you was more real to you than the thing in front of you. Something that some people had and some people had to be shown, and the showing of it was apparently now my job. I will need to bring Biscuit, I said. Lena Marsh looked at the dog. He was still on my knee. His tail was going at a calm, steady rate. The rate that means content settled at home in the moment. He is as of last week, she said carefully, an official program resource. I blinked. There was some debate. She said it was short. The translation team made the argument. They pointed out that the specific data point in Wren's report that was flagged for collective-wide review was not your behavior, Sergeant Webb. It was his. She said this with the tone of someone delivering information that they find simultaneously ridiculous and completely correct. He is a listed program resource, I said, with a designated budget line. She said for food. I said for food, veterinary care, and what the program documentation refers to as operational provisions. She said the person who wrote that line of the budget was not entirely serious, but the line survived review, and so here we are. I looked at Biscuit. He looked back at me. I had found him under a truck in an empty city, starving and frightened, pressing a cold nose against the hand of the only person left. He had walked toward the most dangerous thing in the galaxy because I was there. He had sniffed it and found it interesting. He had changed the course of an apex species assessment of our planet by being completely and without modification exactly what he was, and now he had a budget line. All right, Biscuit, I said, we have got a new job. His tail went at full speed. We started. The next week, the Harlow Initiative ran out of the government building that did not appear on maps. In the city I will not name, staffed eventually by the 40 people Lena Marsh had intended, and then by 60, and then by more. I spent the first year doing what she had asked, describing what had happened on the road in detail for people who needed to understand not just what had occurred, but why it had worked, what the mechanics of it were, what you needed to be carrying inside you to stand in a specific place for 8 hours and not move. The difficulty was that most of what I told them was not teachable in the ordinary sense. You cannot teach a person to care about something. You cannot run a training module on refusing to leave. You cannot build a curriculum around the quality that makes a dog walk toward danger instead of away from it. These are things that either exist in a person or they do not, and the finding of them is the whole of the work. What you can teach is the framework, the habit of addressing what is in front of you rather than talking past it. Practice of using your name and asking for another, the discipline of staying still when everything in you is cataloging exits, the understanding that in a moment of extraordinary threat, the most destabilizing thing you can do to the threat is to be entirely, transparently, undefensively yourself. That much I could teach, that much I taught, and Biscuit helped in the way he always helped, by being exactly himself in every room he entered, which had the effect of reminding everyone in the room what it looked like when trust was given without calculation. He had no technique, he had no strategy. He walked up to people and decided about them and communicated his decision with his tail. And the people he walked up to, without exception, became more human when he did. The 100 years had started. We were going to need every one of them. 2 years into the initiative, a new transmission arrived. It was shorter than the first one and translated faster, because by that point our team was considerably better at the language. It came through the same channel. It carried the identifying frequency that our linguists had isolated as belonging specifically to the Vorai unit that the program documentation referred to as the primary contact, which was a careful and professional way of writing down what I knew, which was VAS. The transmission contained 17 characters in Vorai script. The translation came back in 40 minutes. It read, the small gillless organism as well. It was not a question, it was a statement delivered in the confident tone of something that already knew the answer and was saying it because the saying of it mattered. I read the translation in Lena Marsh's office. She watched me read it, then she looked at Biscuit, who was asleep under her desk, in the spot he had claimed in the first week and never relinquished, his feet moving slightly in whatever his dreams were made of. What do you want to send back? She asked. I thought about it for a moment. Tell them I said that. Yes, he is well. Tell them his food situation has improved significantly. Tell them that he has a new bed and that he does not use it because he prefers my floor. She typed this. The translation system rendered it. The response came back in 6 hours, which by the time scales of interstellar communication was essentially immediate. 2 characters. Our team translated them as received. But the lead linguist on the project, a quiet man named Owen, who had been working with alien communication systems for 15 years and did not overstate things, told me later that the 2 characters were more precisely translated as a word that existed in the Vorai language specifically for communications that are received and found to be satisfying. They had a word for that. They had a word for receiving news of a good dog and finding the news satisfying. I thought about that for a long time. I thought about 4 species that were not there anymore and the ways they had responded to what was in front of them. I thought about a road in a dead city and the way the night had felt when the silence settled in and the cold nose pressed against my fingers in the dark in the 8 hours that had followed. I thought about what it means to be a species that has a word for something. It means you have encountered it enough times to need the word. It means it happens to you regularly enough that the concept required naming somewhere out there in the collective that spanned more space than I could imagine. The Vorkai had encountered enough things that were received and found to be satisfying that they had a specific word for it, whatever else they were, whatever the 4 species had learned about them and stopped being able to. They were also that I told Biscuit this. He was on my floor, which was where he preferred to be in the apartment I had been assigned through the initiative's housing program. The city was dark. Outside the window, everything was quiet, the way it gets when the day is done and the ordinary world is resting. He listened to me with his head raised and his ears forward, the way he listened when the sound of my voice told him that what I was saying mattered, even if he could not know the content. When I finished, he put his chin back on his paws. His tail moved once slow and full. Then it went still. Good, I said, and outside the city breathed its ordinary breath, and above it, somewhere past the atmosphere in the dark, in the vast distance of everything we had not yet learned, a report was making its way through channels we did not understand, and in it somewhere was a small gueless organism. Well, and that for now was